He kissed her like he owned her soul, slow, possessive, searing, while her ex-fiance stood frozen in the crowd, watching the woman he discarded become someone else's obsession. And as Romero Sanchez's mouth hovered over hers, his dark eyes locked on Anthony, he whispered the words that would haunt them all. Let him watch what he lost. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, if someone made you feel small, disposable, like you needed to shrink yourself to be loved, this story is for you. Subscribe now, because Bianca's journey from broken to unbreakable will remind you that the person who destroys you doesn't get to define your worth, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is realize you deserve better. Don't miss a single chapter of her transformation. Let's continue. The underground auction hall breathed with illicit wealth, all exposed brick and industrial elegance transformed into a cathedral of power. Vintage Edison bulbs cast amber shadows across faces that never appeared in Forbes magazines, across transactions that would never see daylight. The city's true elite, the ones who moved markets and buried bodies with equal efficiency, gathered beneath vaulted ceilings where Gothic iron met modern minimalism. This wasn't the sanitized charity circuit of legitimate society. This was where real power assembled, where fortunes changed hands in whispered conversations, where loyalty was purchased and betrayal was punished with permanent solutions. Bianca Heller stood near the registration desk, her black dress a study in deliberate understatement, watching the dangerous choreography unfold with the analytical distance of someone who had learned to navigate predators long before she understood she could become one herself. The dress hugged her frame with architectural precision, the fabric catching low amber light in ways that suggested rather than displayed, revealed strength rather than vulnerability. Her dark hair fell straight and severe past her shoulders, framing a face that held both the memory of past wounds and something harder, something forged in the years since Anthony had discarded her like defective merchandise. At 27, she had learned that competence was the only currency that mattered in Romero Sanchez's world, that beauty was irrelevant unless paired with ruthless efficiency, that survival required becoming essential rather than desirable. Tonight, she preferred to remain operational to manage Romero's acquisitions, catalog his enemies, and vanish before the networking devolved into the territorial posturing that inevitably preceded violence. 4 years had passed since Anthony had ended their engagement with the calculated cruelty of someone disposing of an outdated business plan. 4 years since he had looked at her with those entitled eyes and explained, as if addressing a particularly slow employee, that she simply wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't connected enough, wasn't enough, period, for the empire he intended to build through strategic marriage. He had upgraded to someone with a trust fund, someone whose family name opened boardrooms and country clubs, whose pedigree compensated for what his nouveau riche ambition could not. And Bianca had been left to reconstruct a sense of self-worth he had methodically demolished over 3 years of psychological erosion disguised as love. But she had reconstructed herself. She had rebuilt in silence, without the performative healing or public processing that so many seemed to require. She had taken a position with Sanchez Acquisitions initially as a forensic analyst, vetting investment opportunities and identifying vulnerabilities in competitor operations, and had proven herself through precision rather than charm. Romero Sanchez had noticed her ruthless efficiency, her discretion, her ability to anticipate moves 3 steps before they materialized. Within 2 years, she had become indispensable to him, managing not just his legitimate holdings but occasionally glimpsing, and sometimes orchestrating the shadows where his real empire operated. She knew what he was. Everyone in the city's genuine power structure knew what Romero Sanchez was. But he treated her with a respect Anthony never had, valued her strategic mind as much as her operational execution, and compensated her enough that she had rebuilt not just her confidence but her autonomy, her power, her ability to walk away from anyone who failed to recognize her worth. The atmosphere shifted near the entrance, a predatory awareness that rippled through the crowd signaling someone significant had arrived. Bianca glanced up from her tablet and felt time fracture beneath her feet. Anthony Carmichael moved through the gathering with the manufactured confidence of inherited privilege, attempting to masquerade as earned authority, his tailored Tom Ford tuxedo impeccable, his carefully highlighted hair styled with calculated casualness. He had aged adequately, she noted with the clinical objectivity of someone no longer requiring his validation. The woman attached to his arm was precisely what Bianca had predicted, all aristocratic bone structure and practiced boredom, the kind of trophy wife who understood that marriage was a merger with aesthetic and social prerequisites rather than emotional investment. Their eyes collided across the industrial space. Bianca saw the moment recognition detonated through Anthony's expression, followed immediately by calculation, by assessment. by the instinctive cataloging of whether she remained broken or had become something requiring recalibration. She had transformed since their last encounter. She knew the softness he had criticized as weakness was gone, replaced by a composed lethality that came from surviving his abandonment and emerging tempered rather than shattered. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to demonstrate she was unafraid, short enough to deny him the satisfaction of destabilizing her, then deliberately returned her attention to her tablet as if he were background noise requiring no response. She felt him approach before she saw him, that particular disturbance of space that accompanied unwanted attention, attempting to disguise itself as pleasant surprise. Bianca. His voice carried the same smooth entitlement it always had, as if the past 4 years had been a brief intermission rather than a permanent ending. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I heard you were working as someone's administrative assistant. The diminishment was intentional, the verbal equivalent of patting her head while simultaneously kicking her legs from beneath her. Bianca set down her tablet with measured precision before responding, using the pause to center herself, to access the version of herself that no longer required his approval to exist. Executive associate to Romero Sanchez? She corrected, her voice pleasantly neutral, professionally lethal. And you're still acquiring wives based on their portfolio diversification potential, I see. Anthony's smile calcified at the edges. His companion, who had been examining the auction catalog with studied disinterest, looked up with sharp attention. This is Victoria Ashford Carmichael, Anthony said, the hyphenated surname performing exactly the work he intended. We married 18 months ago. Victoria, this is Bianca. I'm sorry, what was your surname again? I seem to have forgotten. Before Bianca could respond, she felt a presence materialize at her side, solid, commanding, dangerous, in a way that made Anthony's posturing look like a child playing executive dress-up. Romero Sanchez had moved through the crowd with the silence of an apex predator, and now he stood close enough that Bianca could feel the heat radiating from his body, could detect the expensive cologne layered over something darker, something that spoke of violence barely contained beneath civilized surfaces. Heller, Romero said, his voice carrying the subtle rasp of his heritage, smooth as aged bourbon and just as intoxicating. Bianca Heller, though I prefer to think of her as irreplaceable rather than categorized by family lineage. His hand settled on Bianca's waist with casual possession, the touch burning through the thin fabric of her dress with territorial clarity. Romero Sanchez, I don't believe we've been introduced, though I recognize you from business publications. Carmichael Development Group, correct? Your father-in-law's company. The emphasis on father-in-laws was surgical, devastatingly precise. Anthony's face colored as he registered not just the implicit emasculation but the much more pressing reality of who was delivering it. Everyone in their world knew who Romero Sanchez was and what he was. The man who stood before them now looked like he belonged in the shadows, his tailored black suit cut to accommodate the muscular frame of someone who had done his own violence before delegating it. His dark hair swept back from a face that could have belonged to a Caravaggio painting, if not for the cold calculation in his dark eyes and the intricate ink that marked his throat in deliberate patterns. A mandala design emerged from beneath his collar, visible where he had left the top button of his shirt open in calculated disregard for the auction's formal dress code. His left hand, which now held Bianca against him with possessive clarity, bore rings that caught the low-light silver and black onyx, chosen for impact rather than ostentation, for damage rather than decoration. Mr. Sanchez, Anthony said, recovering his composure with visible effort, his voice tight. Of course, your reputation precedes you. I'm certain it does. Romero's smile was all edges, containing no warmth, only the promise of consequences. Bianca was just telling me about a former acquaintance who once made the catastrophic error of underestimating her value. I believe she mentioned he had a consistent pattern of making poor investment decisions, particularly regarding assets he failed to properly appraise. His fingers traced a slow, deliberate circle on Bianca's hip, the gesture intimate and claiming, a public declaration that the woman Anthony had discarded now belonged to someone infinitely more dangerous. The auction began with the mechanical efficiency of illegal commerce dressed in civilized ritual. Bianca stood 3 steps behind, and to Romero's left her designated position during acquisitions, tablet in hand, cataloging each lot with clinical precision. Item 47. A Modigliani with questionable provenance. Item 48. A portfolio of offshore accounts formerly belonging to a Brazilian politician who had recently stopped breathing. Item 49. Residential properties in Prague, the previous owners having relocated permanently to undisclosed locations. Romero bid with subtle gestures, a raised finger, a slight nod while Bianca tracked competitors, noting which players were aggressive, which were cautious, which were bidding on behalf of absent principals. She whispered updates into his ear between lots, her breath barely disturbing the space between them, maintaining the professional distance that had defined their relationship for 4 years. He smelled of sandalwood and gunpowder, of expensive cologne failing to completely mask the violence that clung to him like a second skin. "The Volkov representative is bidding on the Prague properties," she murmured. "Third time this month they've moved into your territory." Romero's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Noted." The crowd shifted near the entrance during Lot 52, that particular quality of awareness that accompanied significant arrivals. Bianca glanced up from her tablet, performing her habitual threat assessment, and felt the ground liquefy beneath her Louboutins. Anthony Carmichael entered with Victoria attached to his arm like expensive jewelry, both of them radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having experienced real consequences. He wore his tuxedo-like armor, his posture broadcasting entitlement across the industrial space. Victoria, blonde, rail-thin, draped in what Bianca immediately identified as vintage Chanel, surveyed the room with the bored superiority of someone who had never worked for anything she possessed. Their eyes met across 40 feet of exposed brick and criminal enterprise. Recognition detonated across Anthony's features: surprise, then calculation, then something uglier. Dismissiveness attempting to masquerade as concern. He leaned toward Victoria, whispered something that made her laugh behind her champagne flute, both of them now staring at Bianca with the casual cruelty of people discussing an amusing curiosity. Bianca's fingers tightened on her tablet, her professional mask threatening to fracture. 4 years of reconstruction, of building herself into someone formidable, and one glance from him threatened to reduce her back to the girl who had believed his promises, who had mistaken manipulation for love. Then she felt it, Romero's attention shifting from the auction to her, that predatory focus that missed nothing. He didn't turn his head, didn't acknowledge her distress overtly, but his posture changed infinitesimally, his body angling slightly toward her in an unconscious gesture of protection. "Who is he?" Romero asked, his voice barely audible beneath the auctioneer's cadence. "No one," Bianca whispered, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Just a ghost. Ghosts don't make you grip your tablet like you're considering using it as a weapon." His dark eyes finally cut toward her, reading everything she was failing to hide. "And they're approaching." Anthony was moving through the crowd with Victoria in tow, his trajectory unmistakable, his smile practiced and predatory. Romero's hand moved to Bianca's waist before Anthony reached them, the touch possessive, claiming, a declaration of ownership that made every eye in their vicinity turn toward the unfolding confrontation. Anthony opened his mouth, that familiar patronizing smile already forming, but Romero spoke first, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with the precision of a blade finding flesh. "You're blocking our view of the auction." Each word was measured, polite, and absolutely lethal. "Perhaps you should return to your seat before you miss something valuable. Though I understand recognizing value has never been your particular strength." Anthony's smile faltered, his eyes darting between Bianca and the hand Romero had placed on her waist with such casual possession. "I was just saying hello to an old friend. Bianca and I have nothing to discuss," Romero finished, his tone suggesting the conversation was already over, had perhaps never begun. "Miss Heller is working. Surely even you understand the concept of professional obligation." The dismissal was surgical. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips, as she registered not just the insult, but the danger radiating from the man delivering it. She tugged on Anthony's sleeve with barely concealed urgency, her social instincts finally recognizing they were in the presence of someone who operated beyond the rules that governed their sanitized world. "Of course," Anthony said, his voice tight, face coloring with humiliation he couldn't quite mask. "I didn't mean to interrupt." He started to turn, then couldn't resist one final attempt at reasserting dominance. "It's just surprising to see Bianca here. She was never comfortable in these kinds of environments." "She's evolved," Romero said, his fingers tightening fractionally on Bianca's waist. "People do that when they're no longer surrounded by mediocrity. Now, if you'll excuse us." Anthony retreated, pulling Victoria with him, but not before Bianca caught the rage flickering behind his eyes, the wounded pride of a man unaccustomed to being dismissed by anyone, let alone in front of witnesses. The moment they were gone, Bianca exhaled shakily, her professional composure threatening to shatter. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." Romero turned to face her fully, his hand still on her waist, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made breathing difficult. He looked at you like you were nothing, like you were still the woman he broke. "I'm not," Bianca said, but her voice betrayed her, carrying the uncertainty she despised. "I know." His thumb traced a slow circle against her hip, the gesture intimate in a way that transcended their 4 years of careful professional distance. "But I don't think you know." Not completely. Music had started playing through hidden speakers, something slow, something dangerous. The auction had paused for intermission, the crowd dispersing toward the bar and private conversations. Romero glanced toward the small clearing that served as a makeshift dance floor, then back to Bianca, a question in his eyes that he didn't voice. She should say no, should maintain the boundaries that had kept their relationship functional, that had protected her from becoming dependent on another man's validation. But Anthony was watching from across the room, and Romero was looking at her like she was something precious rather than broken, and the hand on her waist felt like an anchor in a world that had suddenly become unstable. "Dance with me," Romero said, not quite a question, not quite a command. Bianca set her tablet on a nearby table, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This isn't professional." "No," he agreed, already pulling her toward the floor, his body moving with the fluid grace of a predator, of someone who had learned to fight before he learned to dance. "It's not." He pulled her against him, one hand settling firmly on her lower back, the other capturing her fingers with surprising gentleness. They moved together with an ease that shouldn't have existed between boss and assistant, between Mafia King and the woman who managed his legitimate face. His body led hers through the slow rhythm, close enough that she could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the small scar beneath his jaw that she'd never been close enough to notice before. "You're staring," she whispered. "So are you." His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "And so is he." Bianca didn't need to look to know Anthony was watching, that Victoria was whispering furiously in his ear, that this moment was destroying whatever narrative he'd constructed about her remaining broken and diminished. "Let him watch," Romero said, his voice dropping lower, his hand pressing her closer. "Let him see what he lost." The song shifted into something slower, something that felt like a heartbeat given melody. Romero guided Bianca through the turn with effortless control, his hand splayed across her lower back, fingers pressing into fabric and flesh with possessive certainty. Every eye in the underground auction hall had found them now. The notorious Romero Sanchez dancing with his assistant in a display that transcended professional boundaries and entered territory far more dangerous. "You're trembling," he observed, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I'm angry," Bianca corrected, though her body betrayed her with its response to his proximity, to the heat radiating from him, to the way his thumb had begun tracing small circles against her spine. "At him?" Romero's eyes flicked briefly toward where Anthony stood rigid at the bar, Victoria's hand on his arm, both of them watching with expressions ranging from shock to poorly concealed fury. "At myself." The admission escaped before she could stop it. "For letting him still affect me, for caring that he's here, that he saw me, that he still thinks, that he has any claim to your attention?" Romero's hand slid from her back to her jaw, tilting her face upward with devastating gentleness, forcing her eyes to meet his. "He doesn't. He never did. He had the opportunity to value you, and chose poorly. That's his loss, not your failure." His thumb traced the line of her jaw with agonizing slowness, the touch sending electricity down her spine, short-circuiting every professional boundary she'd constructed over 4 years of working beside him. This close, she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could count the individual strands of silver threading through his black hair, could smell the cognac on his breath mixing with sandalwood and something uniquely him. Romero. His name emerged as barely a whisper. A question, a plea, a warning. "Tell me to stop." His hand cupped her face completely now, his other arm tightening around her waist, pulling her flush against him in a way that left no ambiguity about his intentions. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll release you. We'll finish the auction, return to the office tomorrow, and never speak of this again." But she couldn't. The words wouldn't form because they would be lies, because she'd been lying to herself for months, maybe years, about what Romero Sanchez meant to her, about what she felt when his hand brushed hers during contract signings, when his voice dropped low during private meetings, when he looked at her like she was the only person in the room who mattered. The silence between them stretched, heavy with implication, with 4 years of suppressed tension, finally demanding acknowledgement. Around them, The crowd had stopped pretending to maintain their own conversations. Even the bartender had frozen mid-pour, sensing something significant was about to detonate. "Say something," Romero commanded, his voice rough. Instead, Bianca rose on her toes, closing the final inches between them, her hands sliding up his chest to rest against his shoulders. It wasn't quite permission, but it was answer enough. Romero's control shattered. He kissed her with the focused intensity of a man who had been restraining himself for far too long, his mouth claiming hers with devastating thoroughness. It wasn't gentle. It was possession, declaration, a public staking of claim that obliterated every professional pretense they'd maintained. His hand tangled in her hair, tilting her head back to deepen the kiss, while his other arm banded around her waist, lifting her slightly off the ground, eliminating any space between their bodies. Bianca's world narrowed to sensation, the taste of cognac and danger on his tongue, the scratch of his beard against her skin, the way his heart hammered against her palms, the low sound that rumbled through his chest that might have been satisfaction, or surrender, or both. She kissed him back with 4 years of suppressed wanting, her fingers gripping his shoulders hard enough to leave marks through expensive fabric, her body molding to his with a rightness that terrified her. The underground auction hall had gone absolutely silent. No conversations, no clinking glasses, no shuffling feet. Just the distant hum of Edison bulbs and the sound of 2 people breathing hard against each other's mouths. When Romero finally pulled back, it was only far enough to rest his forehead against hers, his eyes dark and fierce, his breathing ragged. His thumb brushed across her swollen lips with devastating tenderness, a contrast to the claiming violence of the kiss. "Let him watch what he lost," Romero whispered, his voice carrying just far enough for Anthony to hear, for everyone to hear, for the multiple phones now recording to capture. Then louder, his eyes still locked on Bianca's face with an intensity that felt like its own form of touch. "Let them all watch." Bianca's gaze finally broke from Romero's to find Anthony across the room. His face had gone white, then red, his expression cycling through shock, rage, and something that looked almost like grief, the belated recognition of a man realizing the magnitude of his mistake only after it had become irreversible. Victoria was pulling at his arm, hissing something urgent, but Anthony couldn't look away from the woman he'd discarded now being claimed by someone infinitely more dangerous, more powerful, more everything than he would ever be. Camera phones were raised throughout the crowd, documenting the moment with the hungry efficiency of people who recognized they were witnessing something that would ripple through their world. By morning, the footage would circulate through every criminal network, every society page, every gossip channel that tracked the movements of Miami's true power structure. The line between professional and personal hadn't just blurred, it had been incinerated completely, leaving only ash and the terrifying possibility of what came next. The Maserati cut through Miami's late-night streets with predatory silence, its engine a low purr that matched the tension crackling inside the vehicle. Romero drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift inches from Bianca's thigh, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin through her dress. Neither had spoken since leaving the auction, since walking past Anthony's stricken face and the crowd's hungry stares, since climbing into the car that smelled of leather and the residual ghost of that devastating kiss. Bianca's tablet sat forgotten in her lap, its screen dark, all the evening's acquisitions and threat assessments rendered irrelevant by what had transpired on that makeshift dance floor. Her lips still felt swollen, her body still humming with the aftershocks of being claimed so publicly, so thoroughly. She should say something, should establish boundaries, reassert professionalism, protect herself from the catastrophic vulnerability of wanting something, someone this badly. But the words wouldn't form because they would require lying, and she had spent 4 years being nothing but truthful with Romero Sanchez, even when that truth was delivered through clinical reports and strategic assessments, rather than emotional honesty. "You're thinking too loudly," Romero said finally, his voice rough in the enclosed space. "I can hear your mind constructing arguments, defenses, reasons why what happened tonight was a mistake. Wasn't it?" Bianca kept her eyes fixed on the passing streetlights, on the blur of palm trees and Art Deco architecture, anywhere but on the man beside her whose mere presence made rational thought nearly impossible. "You're my employer. I work for you. We just destroyed 4 years of professional boundaries in front of an audience that included federal informants, rival organizations, and at least 3 journalists." "I know." The Maserati turned onto a private road, heading toward Coral Gables, toward the estate Bianca had visited countless times for meetings but never at night, never like this. I've known exactly what I was risking since the moment I put my hand on your waist. Then why? Because watching him speak to you like you were nothing, like you were still the broken girl he discarded, made me want to put a bullet in his skull in front of everyone. Romero's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, his voice dropping to something dangerous, something barely controlled. And I realized I've been lying to myself for 2 years, pretending what I feel for you is professional respect, that the reason I keep you close is because you're competent and discreet, when the truth is I can't fucking breathe properly when you're not in the same room. The confession landed between them like a grenade, its implications detonating through Bianca's carefully constructed defenses. 2 years? 26 months? Romero corrected with devastating precision. Since the night you stayed late to help me negotiate the Alvarez merger, and I found you asleep at your desk at 3 a.m, your hair falling across the contract you'd been reviewing, and I realized I would burn down anyone who tried to harm you. The estate's gates opened automatically, responding to the Maserati's approach. The mansion beyond was all modern lines and strategic lighting, a fortress disguised as architectural elegance. Romero pulled into the private garage, the door closing behind them with mechanical finality, sealing them into dim space that smelled of expensive machinery and motor oil. He killed the engine but made no move to exit, his hands still gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing preventing him from reaching for her. I need you to understand something, Bianca. What happened tonight wasn't impulse. It wasn't performance for your ex's benefit. I've wanted to kiss you since the day you told me the Prague deal was too risky, that I was letting ego override strategy, and you were right. I've wanted to touch you every time you lean over my desk to show me projections, every time you stand beside me in meetings wearing that perfume that makes me lose focus, every time you look at me like I'm not a monster, but just a man you trust to protect you. Bianca's breath caught in her throat. She turned to face him finally, finding his dark eyes already on her, molten with wanting and something deeper. Something that looked almost like fear, the vulnerability of a man unaccustomed to admitting he needed anything beyond power and control. I don't think you're a monster, she whispered. You should. Romero's laugh was bitter, self-aware. You've seen enough of what I do, what I'm capable of. You catalog my violence every time you create those clinical reports about eliminated threats and restructured territories. You know exactly what these hands have done. I know you've built an empire from nothing. I know you protect the people loyal to you with the same ruthlessness you destroy your enemies. I know you've never lied to me, never diminished me, never made me feel like I needed to be anyone other than exactly who I am. Bianca reached across the console, her fingers finding his where they still gripped the steering wheel. I know you saw me tonight when Anthony tried to make me invisible. Romero's control fractured. He pulled her across the console with startling strength, his mouth finding hers with the same devastating intensity as the kiss at the auction. But private now, just for them, without the performance or the audience. His hands framed her face like she was something precious he was terrified of breaking, even as his kiss consumed her with barely restrained hunger. Come inside, he murmured against her lips, his voice hoarse. Stay with me tonight, not because you're my assistant, not because of what happened with him, but because you want to. Because you feel this too. Bianca pulled back just enough to meet his eyes, to see the man beneath the reputation. The loneliness he masked with power, the hunger that had nothing to do with physical desire, and everything to do with being seen, being chosen, being wanted for who he was rather than what he could provide. I'm terrified, she admitted, the words barely audible. So am I. Romero's thumb traced her cheekbone with aching gentleness. I'm terrified of how much I need you. Of what it means that you've become the one person whose opinion matters, whose safety I prioritize above strategic advantage. Of what happens if you wake up tomorrow and realize you've made a mistake. Then we'll be terrified together. Bianca kissed him again, softer this time, a promise rather than passion. Take me inside, Romero. Show me the man you are when the world isn't watching. They moved through the mansion in charged silence, Romero's hand enveloping hers as he led her past rooms designed for entertaining, past the home office where they'd worked countless late nights, maintaining professional distance. Upstairs she'd never climbed to private quarters she'd never seen. His bedroom was surprisingly spare, dark wood, minimal furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the estate's grounds and the glittering city beyond. He turned to face her in the dim light filtering through those windows, and for the first time since she'd known him, Romero Sanchez looked uncertain. If you want to leave, I'll take you home. No consequences, no awkwardness. We'll find a way to... Bianca silenced him by reaching for the zipper of her dress, sliding it down with deliberate slowness, watching his breath catch as fabric pooled at her feet. "I'm not leaving. I'm choosing to stay. I'm choosing you." Bianca woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows, and the warmth of Romero's body curved against her back, his arm heavy across her waist in possessive sleep. For a moment, she allowed herself the luxury of simply existing in this space, sore in ways that made her blush, marked in places hidden beneath expensive sheets, transformed by a night that had obliterated every boundary between who she'd been and who she was becoming. Her phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, then again, and again, the urgent vibration of someone's world imploding in real time. Romero stirred against her, his lips finding the space between her shoulder blades. "Ignore it," he murmured, voice rough with sleep and satisfaction. But Bianca's professional instincts overrode the temptation to remain cocooned in this moment. She reached for the phone, her stomach dropping as she scanned the notifications flooding her screen. Text messages from former colleagues, emails from reporters, social media alerts that multiplied even as she watched. Anthony had struck while they slept. His Instagram post showed a carefully curated photograph of him and Victoria at last night's auction, all polished elegance and implied superiority. But the caption was pure venom, disguised as concern. Heartbreaking to see former friends make choices that compromise their integrity. Bianca was once a good person before she became involved with dangerous individuals. Praying she finds her way back to who she really is. Number concerned, number former friends, number bad influences. The comments beneath were predictably vicious, a feeding frenzy of speculation and judgment from people who knew nothing about her beyond what Anthony's narrative provided. But it was the subsequent posts from accounts clearly coordinated with his that made Bianca's blood run cold. Insinuations about criminal associations, questions about whether she was cooperating with federal investigations, suggestions that she'd traded integrity for luxury, implying she was either complicit or a victim requiring rescue. "What is it?" Romero was fully awake now, his body tensing against hers as he registered her stillness. Bianca handed him the phone without speaking, watching his face darken as he scrolled through Anthony's calculated character assassination. The man beside her transformed from lover to predator in seconds, his jaw setting with lethal intent, his eyes going flat and cold in a way she recognized from business meetings that ended with competitors vanishing from the market entirely. "He's trying to destroy your reputation," Romero said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying than rage would have been. "He's painting you as either criminal or victim, forcing you into a narrative where you lose regardless of the truth." "It's just social media," Bianca said, even as her hands trembled. "It doesn't matter what people who don't know me think. It matters when federal agents use it as justification to approach you." Romero set the phone down with deliberate care, his hand finding hers, his thumb stroking across her knuckles. "And they will. He's given them the opening they've been waiting for." He was right. By noon, 2 FBI agents appeared outside the coffee shop, where Bianca had stopped on her way to change clothes at her apartment. They were polite, professional, utterly relentless in their friendly concern for her well-being. Agent Sarah Martinez. The name felt like cosmic mockery, slid a business card across the small table with a sympathetic smile. "We've been watching Mr. Sanchez's organization for some time, Miss Heller. We understand you work closely with him. We also understand relationships can become complicated. We're prepared to offer complete immunity in exchange for your cooperation. Help us understand his business operations, and we'll ensure you walk away from this without consequences." "I have nothing to tell you," Bianca said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I manage legitimate business interests. If you have questions about Sanchez acquisitions, you're welcome to review our public filings." "Miss Heller." Agent Martinez leaned forward, her expression shifting to something harder. "We have footage from last night's auction. We know who was there, what was being sold. We know those weren't legitimate business transactions. And we know that Kiss made you a target. Help us protect you before it's too late." "I don't require protection from Mr. Sanchez." Bianca stood, gathering her purse with hands that only shook slightly. "If you have actual questions about my employment, contact my attorney. Otherwise, I have nothing further to discuss." She walked away, feeling their eyes on her back, feeling the weight of the choice she was making, the bridge she was burning by refusing their offer. By the time she reached Romero's estate that evening, her phone had exploded with messages from concerned former colleagues, from journalists requesting comment, from Anthony's friends offering sympathetic concern that felt more like reconnaissance. Romero met her at the door, reading her expression with the precision of someone who had spent 4 years learning her tells. The federal agents approached you. Yes. Bianca stepped into his arms, needing the solid reality of him. The confirmation that choosing him was worth whatever came next. They offered immunity in exchange for testimony against you. And you refused. It wasn't a question. Romero's arms tightened around her, his face buried in her hair. You should have taken it, Bianca. You should have protected yourself. I did protect myself. I refused to betray the only person who's treated me like I matter. She pulled back to meet his eyes, seeing the conflict there, the war between wanting to keep her safe and needing her beside him. What are you going to do about Anthony? Something dangerous flickered across Romero's features. What needs to be done? Romero. He declared war. Amor. Not just on me, but on you. He tried to destroy your reputation, to paint you as criminal or victim, to make you untouchable in legitimate society. Romero's voice was soft, almost gentle, which made the promise of violence more terrifying. That requires a response. Don't kill him. The words emerged before Bianca could stop them, not because she cared about Anthony's survival, but because she understood the consequences of that particular line being crossed. Please. It will bring too much attention, too much risk to you. I have no intention of killing him. Romero's smile was all edges, nothing warm in it. Death would be mercy. I'm going to make him understand exactly what he lost, what he can never have again, and what happens to people who try to harm what's mine. The business meeting happened 3 days later in a private room at a restaurant Romero owned, where the staff knew better than to hear anything, and the security cameras had convenient blind spots. Bianca wasn't present. Romero had insisted she maintain distance, but she pieced together what happened from Marco's carefully edited report and the haunted expression on Anthony's face when footage of him leaving the pited restaurant surfaced online. Anthony had arrived arrogant, assuming his social position and family connections provided armor against consequence. He'd left 2 hours later pale and shaking, his expensive suit rumpled, his carefully styled hair disheveled. Whatever Romero had said, and Bianca suspected it had been more than words. Suspected Anthony had experienced a preview of the violence Romero was capable of, had transformed him from vindictive ex to terrified survivor. The social media posts about Bianca stopped immediately. The coordinated character assassination evaporated. Anthony's friends suddenly had no comment when journalists reached out for follow-up. Within a week, Anthony and Victoria had relocated to his family's estate in Connecticut, citing business opportunities that required his immediate attention elsewhere. What did you do? Bianca asked that night, tracing the tension still visible in Romero's shoulders, the evidence of controlled rage that hadn't fully dissipated. I explained the consequences of continuing his campaign against you. Romero's voice was carefully neutral. I showed him what happens to people who threaten what belongs to me. I made it clear that his wealth and connections mean nothing compared to my reach, my resources, my willingness to pursue retaliation across any distance or boundary he thinks might protect him. Did you hurt him? Not permanently, not yet. Romero turned to face her, his eyes dark and serious. But I would have, Bianca. If he'd persisted, if he'd done anything more to damage you, I would have made him disappear in ways that ensured he was never found. I need you to understand that about me, about what loving me means. I don't have boundaries when it comes to protecting you. I don't have mercy for threats against what's mine. Bianca should have been frightened, should have recognized this as the moment to retreat, to reclaim her independence, to acknowledge that loving someone this dangerous was its own form of self-destruction. Instead, she felt something settle in her chest, some fundamental question finding its answer. I understand, she said simply, and I'm not going anywhere. The security detail appeared the morning after Anthony fled to Connecticut, 2 men in dark suits who followed Bianca's movements with professional discretion, close enough to intervene, far enough to maintain the illusion of freedom. She couldn't buy coffee without them scanning the shop first, couldn't enter her apartment without them clearing each room, couldn't exist without the constant awareness that she had become a liability requiring protection. This is necessary, Romero said when she confronted him about the surveillance, his voice brooking no argument. The Volkov Bratva has been asking questions about you. The Calabrese family is looking for leverage after we took the Prague properties. You're not just my assistant anymore, Bianca. You're my weakness, and every enemy I've ever made knows it. The words should have felt like a burden. Instead, they felt like recognition, acknowledgement that she mattered enough to protect, that her safety had become strategic priority rather than professional courtesy. The threats materialized within days. A bouquet delivered to her apartment with no card, just black roses and the faint scent of gasoline. A clear message about what happened to Mafia girlfriends who made themselves visible. Anonymous emails suggesting she reconsider her associations before accidents happened. A near miss in traffic that Marcus, her lead security, insisted was deliberate positioning rather than careless driving. Romero responded by moving her into the estate entirely, eliminating the vulnerability of separate residences, of commutes that could be intercepted, of moments where she existed outside his protective radius. Her apartment became a forwarding address, her life compressed into his fortress, her independence sacrificed for survival. But it was the meeting with Romero's inner circle that truly marked her transformation from assistant to something more dangerous, more integral. 6 men sat around the conference table, lieutenants who controlled territories, operations, the violent machinery of Romero's empire. They watched her enter with expressions ranging from calculation to outright hostility. These men who had earned their positions through blood and loyalty, now forced to accept a woman whose qualifications were professional competence and access to their boss's bed. "Gentlemen," Romero said, his hand on Bianca's waist, the touch both possessive and strategic. "Bianca will be joining our operational meetings moving forward. She'll have full access to our business structures, all of them." The silence was hostile, questioning. Marco, Romero's second, finally spoke what the others were thinking. "With respect, boss, she's an analyst. She handles the legitimate side. Bringing her into operational planning is strategic." Bianca cut him off, her voice steady despite her hammering pulse. She'd spent 3 weeks studying the territories they controlled, the competitors they faced, the vulnerabilities in their distribution networks. "You're losing 12% of revenue in the port district because your transportation schedules are predictable. The Volkov Bratva has figured out your rotation and is intercepting shipments before they reach clients. You need randomized delivery windows and decoy vehicles to restore security." The room went silent. Marco's expression shifted from dismissive to calculating, recognizing that she'd identified a problem they'd been bleeding money over for months. "She's right," he admitted finally, grudging respect entering his tone. "We've been trying to solve the port situation for weeks." "Then perhaps you should listen when she speaks," Romero said quietly, dangerously. "Bianca isn't here because of our personal relationship. She's here because she's brilliant, ruthless when necessary, and sees patterns you miss. She's not a liability, she's an asset. Anyone who fails to recognize that is welcome to seek employment elsewhere." The message was clear. Accept her or leave. No middle ground, no compromise. Bianca met each man's eyes in turn, refusing to flinch, refusing to show the fear churning beneath her professional mask. This was the world she'd chosen, the transformation she'd accepted. No longer the assistant who remained safely behind legitimate operations. Now the partner who stood beside Romero in the darkness, who understood the violence and made strategic decisions about its application. The shift from assistant to partner had begun, and there was no going back. The supposed safe location was a medical office in Coral Gables, where Bianca had an appointment with a physician Romero's organization used for discreet healthcare. Marcus and another guard, Pavel, had cleared the building twice, checked every entrance, positioned themselves strategically. The doctor was on Romero's payroll, the staff vetted and loyal. It should have been secure. But the Volkov Bratva had been patient, studying patterns for weeks, waiting for the single moment when Bianca would be separated from Romero by walls and distance. They hit during the examination, when she was alone in the room, when Marcus was stationed outside the door and Pavel was covering the rear exit. The window exploded inward with professional precision flash grenades, suppressed gunfire, Marcus's body hitting the floor before he could reach for his weapon. Bianca's scream died in her throat as a hood came down over her head, as hands grabbed her with brutal efficiency, as she was hauled through the shattered window into a van that peeled away before Pavel could respond to the chaos erupting inside. The entire abduction took 47 seconds, executed with the surgical precision of operators who had done this before, who knew exactly how much time they had before reinforcements arrived. The hood came off in a basement that smelled of mold and old blood, concrete walls sweating moisture, a single bulb casting harsh shadows. 3 men surrounded her professional kidnappers who had cable-tied her to a metal chair with practiced efficiency. The one who spoke had a thick Russian accent and eyes that held no emotion, no remorse, just the cold calculation of someone executing a business transaction. "Mr. Sanchez will receive proof of life in 1 hour," he said, holding up a phone to photograph her restrained and terrified. "He will receive our demands shortly after. If he complies, you will be returned unharmed. If he does not," the Russian shrugged, the gesture conveying infinite, unpleasant possibilities. "He'll kill you," Bianca said, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "All of you, everyone connected to this. He doesn't negotiate." "Everyone negotiates when they care about something." The Russian smiled without warmth. "And Mr. Sanchez has made it very clear he cares about you. This makes you valuable. This makes you leverage." They left her alone in the darkness after taking the photograph, the sound of their footsteps receding upstairs, a door locking with mechanical finality. Bianca counted her breathing, fought the panic threatening to overwhelm rational thought, forced herself to assess her situation with the analytical precision Romero had trained into her over 4 years of working beside him. The zip ties were professional grade, cutting into her wrists when she tested them. The chair was bolted to the floor. The basement had no windows, only the single bulb and concrete walls that would muffle any sound she made. She was alone, restrained, separated from Romero by unknown distance, and whatever demands the Volkov Bratva had made that he couldn't accept without appearing weak to every other organization watching this play out. Time became fluid in the darkness. Hours passed, marked only by the changing of guards, by bottles of water forced between her lips, by the Russian returning periodically to photograph her deteriorating condition as proof she remained alive. No food, no bathroom privacy, no information about what was happening in the world beyond this basement. Just isolation, and the growing certainty that rescue might not come, that Romero might be forced to make calculations about acceptable losses, about whether one woman was worth the territorial concessions the Volkov Bratva would demand. But she knew him, knew the man beneath the reputation, the one who had confessed his terror of losing her, who had declared her safety his priority above strategic advantage. Romero Sanchez didn't negotiate. He retaliated. He eliminated threats with such overwhelming violence that others learned from the example. The first sign of rescue came 48 hours into her captivity, distant explosions that shook dust from the ceiling, the muffled sound of automatic weapons fire growing progressively closer. The guards in her basement scrambled, shouting in Russian, arguing about protocols, about whether to execute her or use her as a human shield. The Russian who'd done all the speaking grabbed her by the hair, pressing a pistol against her temple, his other hand fumbling with a phone. "Tell him to stop," the Russian snarled, his professional calm fractured by genuine fear. "Tell him we'll kill you if he doesn't." The basement door exploded inward with a concussive force that temporarily deafened her. Bianca saw Romero through the smoke and chaos covered in blood that clearly wasn't his tailored suit shredded and scorched, his eyes absolutely feral with rage and single-minded purpose. He moved through the guards with lethal efficiency, his pistol firing with mechanical precision, each shot finding its target before they could react to his presence. The Russian's gun pressed harder against Bianca's temple, his voice cracking as he screamed demands in fractured English. Romero didn't hesitate, didn't negotiate, didn't show any recognition of the threat. He fired once a perfect headshot that dropped the Russian instantly, the man's body collapsing away from Bianca, his pistol clattering across concrete. Then Romero was there, cutting through the zip ties with a knife that appeared from somewhere, his hands shaking as they checked her for injuries, his face a mask of barely controlled violence and devastating relief. Blood covered him, spattered across his face, soaked into his clothing, coating his hands that now touched her with aching gentleness despite their capacity for destruction. "Are you hurt?" His voice was hoarse, raw, nothing like the controlled man she knew. "Did they—" "I'm okay," Bianca managed, her own voice breaking as adrenaline and terror finally caught up with her. "Romero, I'm okay." He pulled her against him with enough force to bruise, his face buried in her hair, his body shaking with the aftershocks of whatever violence he'd committed to reach her. She could hear shouting from above, could smell smoke and gunpowder and blood, could feel the rapid hammer of his heart against her cheek. "I burned their world for you," Romero whispered, his voice absolutely steady, despite the trembling in his hands. "The Volkov Bratva no longer exists. Every lieutenant, every soldier, every asset they controlled gone. I made them an example of what happens when someone takes what's mine." Bianca pulled back just enough to see his face, to register the cold finality in his eyes, the absolute absence of remorse or hesitation. He had committed genocide for her, had eliminated an entire criminal organization with the systematic thoroughness of someone erasing a mistake from existence. "How many?" she asked, not sure why the number mattered, not sure what answer she wanted. "Everyone who participated, everyone who knew, everyone who could claim retaliation rights." Romero's hand cupped her face with devastating tenderness, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. his eyes searching hers for judgment, for horror, for rejection. 47 people across 6 locations in coordinated strikes. I didn't negotiate, didn't offer mercy, didn't stop until there was no one left to threaten you again. She should have been horrified. Should have recognized this as the moment to understand exactly what loving Romero Sanchez meant, what kind of violence he was capable of when someone threatened what belonged to him. Instead, Bianca felt something settle in her chest, some fundamental question about whether she could survive in his world, finding its answer in the blood covering his hands and the relief in his eyes. "Take me home," she whispered, her fingers tangling with his despite the blood, despite everything. "Take me home, Romero." He lifted her effortlessly, carrying her through the basement carnage, past the bodies of guards who had touched her, past the evidence of systematic execution that had cleared the path to her rescue. Outside, dawn was breaking over Miami, casting golden light across a residential street, now swarming with Romero's soldiers. With vehicles blocking every exit, with the smoking remains of a safe house that no longer existed. Marco appeared at Romero's side, his own clothing spattered with evidence of participation in the night's violence. "The cleanup crews are en route. We'll have this location scrubbed within 3 hours. No witnesses, no evidence, no bodies to identify." "Good." Romero didn't slow his stride toward the waiting SUV, didn't loosen his grip on Bianca for even a moment. Anyone who saw anything doesn't remember seeing it. Anyone who asks questions stops asking them. This never happened. Bianca rested her head against his chest as he slid into the vehicle's back seat, still holding her like she might vanish if he released her. Through the tinted windows, she watched Miami wake up, watched ordinary people beginning ordinary days, completely unaware of the war that had been waged while they slept, of the organization that had been erased from existence because they'd made the catastrophic mistake of touching Romero Sanchez's woman. "I love you," she said quietly, the words emerging without conscious decision, without fear or hesitation. "I love you, and I'm not afraid of what that means anymore." Romero's arms tightened around her, his face buried in her hair, his voice rough when he finally responded. "You should be afraid. You should run from me, from this life, from what I've made you part of." "I know," Bianca agreed, her fingers tracing the patterns of blood drying on his hands. "But I'm not running. I'm staying. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you." The estate's master bathroom filled with steam as Romero ran water into the massive soaking tub, testing the temperature with meticulous attention despite the blood still crusted under his fingernails, despite the exhaustion carved into his features after 48 hours of systematic violence. He'd refused to let anyone else tend to Bianca, had carried her directly to their bedroom, had locked the door with finality that made clear they would not be disturbed regardless of how urgent the business waiting below. Bianca watched him from where she sat on the marble counter, her wrists bruised from zip ties, her body aching from hours restrained in that basement, her mind still processing the scope of what Romero had done. 47 people eliminated in coordinated strikes, an entire criminal organization erased because they'd touched her. The violence should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like devotion expressed in the only language his world understood. "Come here," Romero said softly, extending his hand to help her down, supporting her weight as he carefully removed what remained of her clothing, fabric torn and stained from her captivity. His hands shook slightly as they traced the bruises emerging on her skin, as they catalogued each minor injury with devastating attention. "I should have protected you better. Should have anticipated they would move on a medical facility. Should have—" "You saved me." Bianca caught his face between her palms, forcing his eyes to meet hers. "You burned down their entire organization to get me back. You didn't negotiate, didn't calculate acceptable losses, didn't make me prove I was worth the cost. You just came for me. Always." Romero's voice was raw, stripped of the control he usually maintained. "I will always come for you, Bianca. There is no distance I won't cross, no violence I won't commit, no enemy too powerful to eliminate if they threaten you." He helped her into the tub, the hot water stinging against a braided skin but washing away the physical residue of captivity. Romero stripped methodically, revealing the evidence of his rescue operation: bruises across his ribs where body armor had caught rounds, burns on his forearms from close-quarters combat, the physical cost of the war he'd waged. He slid into the water behind her, pulling her back against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with aching tenderness. "I'm not afraid of your darkness anymore," Bianca said into the steam-filled silence, her fingers tracing patterns on his scarred forearms. "I'm not afraid of what you're capable of, what you've done, what you'll do. I understand now that your violence isn't cruelty, it's protection. It's loyalty expressed in blood. Romero's arms tightened around her, his face buried in her wet hair. You were never meant to fear it. You were meant to stand beside it, to understand that everything I've built, every terrible thing I've done, means nothing if I can't protect the one person who makes any of it matter. They stayed in the water until it cooled, until the blood and fear had been washed away, until only the truth of what they were together remained. Romero dried her with reverent attention, tended to her bruises with antiseptic and careful hands, then carried her to their bed as dawn light filtered through the windows. What happened between them then was different from their first night, less desperation, more certainty, complete surrender to what they were together, to the darkness they shared, to the violent devotion that bound them more permanently than any legal contract. His hands worshipped bruises he'd failed to prevent. His mouth traced injuries with devastating gentleness. His body claimed hers with the possession of a man who had just fought a war to keep her. Afterward, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled of them both, Romero spoke with quiet finality. Tomorrow, I'm calling a meeting of the entire organization. Every lieutenant, every soldier, every associate who operates under my authority. And I'm making a formal declaration that you are untouchable, that harming you means declaring war on me personally, that your safety is equivalent to my own. That makes me a target, Bianca pointed out, though her voice held no fear, only acceptance. That makes you my queen. Romero rolled to face her, his dark eyes serious, his hand cupping her face with aching tenderness. Stand beside me, Bianca. Not behind me as my assistant, not hidden away for your protection, but beside me as my equal, my partner in everything I've built. Rule this empire with me. Bianca kissed him slowly, tasting the promise and the danger and the absolute certainty of what her answer would be. Yes. 3 months later, Bianca stood at Romero's side in the private conference room of a neutral luxury hotel, surrounded by the most dangerous men in the southeastern United States. The summit brought together 5 major organizations to negotiate territorial boundaries and establish protocols for the coming year, a gathering that happened annually, where fortunes were decided and wars were prevented or declared through careful diplomacy backed by credible threats of violence. She wore power like a second skin, now a black suit tailored to perfection, her dark hair pulled back in a severe style that emphasized the transformation from assistant to authority. From the woman Anthony had discarded to the queen who commanded respect through competence and the absolute backing of the man beside her. The Port District remains Sanchez territory, Bianca said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room as she addressed the Calabrese family's territorial challenge. Any attempt to encroach will be met with the same response the Volkov-Bratva received. We don't negotiate on matters of sovereignty, and we don't tolerate challenges to established boundaries. The Calabrese representative, a man twice her age who had built his reputation on brutality, met her eyes and nodded with grudging respect. Understood. The Calabrese family has no interest in repeating the Volkov mistake. No one mentioned that the Volkov-Bratva no longer existed, that their elimination had been so complete and systematic that even their name had become cautionary tale rather than active organization. Everyone in this room knew what Romero Sanchez had done, what he was capable of when someone threatened what belonged to him. The meeting concluded with agreements signed, boundaries respected, peace maintained through the credible threat of overwhelming retaliation. As the other organizations filed out, Marco approached with unusual hesitation, extending his phone toward Bianca. "Thought you might want to see this," he said simply. The screen showed a news article from a Connecticut Society blog, Anthony and Victoria's divorce announcement, citing irreconcilable differences. But it was the accompanying photograph that made Bianca pause. Anthony looking haggard and diminished, standing outside a courtroom, his expression haunted by losses that extended far beyond his marriage. Beneath the article, someone had shared footage from the underground auction 3 months ago, Bianca in Romero's arms, being kissed like she was the only thing in the world that mattered, transforming before everyone's eyes from discarded ex-fiancé to claimed queen. Bianca felt nothing looking at Anthony's defeated face. No satisfaction, no residual pain, just the distant recognition of a bullet dodged, of heartbreak that had redirected her toward something infinitely more dangerous and real than anything he could have offered. "You good?" Romero asked quietly, his hand finding the small of her back with familiar possession. "I'm grateful," Bianca said honestly, handing Marco back his phone. "He broke me in exactly the way I needed to be broken to become who I was meant to be." That evening, they stood on the estate's terrace overlooking Miami's glittering skyline, the city spread beneath them like a kingdom claimed through blood and strategic brilliance. Romero's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, both of them comfortable in silence that no longer required filling. "Everything I've built, we build together now," Romero murmured against her hair, the promise carrying the weight of formal declaration, of complete partnership in empire and darkness. "My territory is your territory. My enemies are your enemies. My power is your power. And my loyalty is your loyalty," Bianca completed, turning in his arms to face him. This man who had seen her broken, and claimed her anyway, who had taught her that strength came not from avoiding darkness, but from standing beside someone in it. "My strategy is your strategy. My devotion is your devotion." They kissed as the sun set over their empire, two people who had found each other in violence and chose each other in blood, who had transformed from boss and assistant into king and queen of a world that valued power above all else. No longer broken, no longer alone, no longer afraid of what they were capable of together. Just a queen and her king, ruling their darkness with ruthless efficiency and violent devotion, exactly as they were always meant to.